highlight line 8 in the pseudocode. Line 8 in the pseudocode will do some computation first. Okay, the computation is 20 times the sum of I and 2. Okay, in other words, when we execute line 8, we will evaluate, okay, what is the value of I, because of the previous statement, it's going to be 0. 0 plus 2 is 2, 20 times 2 is 40. Effectively, we are passing a value of 40 by reference to parameter x in subroutine reset. We are resetting a value of 40 to 0, which does not make any sense. Okay, it does not make any sense because the value 40 does not have a column to live in. It is not a local variable. It is not a bi-val parameter. It is not a global variable. As a result, there's no column to specify to pass to parameter x. Is that making sense so far? Or is it logical to perceive this as illogical?
What?
It should seem illogical at this point because we are passing by reference something that does not have a column to live in. It is not a variable. It is not a pass by value parameter. So which column is parameter x going to refer to? That's the question.
Isn't it? It's like one refers to the other.
Well,
So
what is it going to refer to? That's the question. I mean, it cannot. I mean, there's nothing to refer to. As it turns out, when you execute line 8, this is what happens. Okay, this is row 8 of the trace is the execution of line 8 of the pseudocode. And here we have 3 columns to set up. One column, I give it a name of expression, which is actually, it should be nameless, it should be anonymous. The second column is the usual return line number, and the third column is the usual parameter x. So things get a little interesting here. The expression, this entire expression, does not specify a column. It only gives me a value that has no column. So in theory, the value of an expression does not have a column, and therefore it cannot be passed as an argument to a bi-ref parameter. Okay, so here we have to go back to the terminology a little bit. Whatever is on the left-hand side of the arrow is called an argument, and whatever it is passed to is called a parameter. So these two terms, sometimes people would use them interchangeably, but they actually mean different things. The argument is something that you can only specify when you're invoking the subroutine. The parameter, on the other hand, is specified by the subroutine itself. So in this case, 20 times I plus 2 is called the argument. It is used to tell the subroutine what should go into parameter x. So what happens in this case when we trace line 8 is we dynamically create or allocate a column just to store the result of 40. I mistakenly put down 20 here. It should be a 40. And then x can become an alias of column D because now we do have a column D to store the temporary value of 40, which I mistyped as 20. Okay? And that makes the subroutine happy. The subroutine is happy because now it knows where to go back to when it's all done, and x being a parameter that is passed by reference is also referring to a column. Okay? So inside the subroutine, when I execute the subroutine, it will go ahead and reset column D to 0 when we get to that line. And when we're all done, it will still deallocate the 3 columns the same way that we usually do. But it doesn't do any harm. It does not do any harm to the invoking code because column D does not belong to anything. It has no name whatsoever. It just makes the subroutine itself happy. Okay? So you might want to just kind of read this note here and make sure you understand the nature of this, of passing an expression by reference to a parameter. The reason why this can be important is because when you move on to cisp300, you will be using pass by reference at some point. And then you will have to understand why sometimes, even though a parameter is specified to be passed by reference, you can still pass an expression to that particular parameter. How many people have plans, to learn how to program in Python at some point of time? Okay. Now Python is interesting in a way. It only has one type of parameters. Guess which type it has?
Reference.
Yep. It only has passed by reference parameters. It does not have passed by value. So as a result, everything that you pass to a subroutine are passed by reference, and occasionally you have to pass something that is the result of a calculation. So it's like this one. And this is what happens when you specify a program like that. Okay. So this one, this topic is not something that I will ask you guys in the midterm, in the final exam. I'm just putting this out because I'm pretty sure some people will have a question about this sort of thing. It's like, okay, what do I do when I specify an expression that is calculated on the fly to a parameter that is passed by reference? And this is exactly what is happening when you have code like that. Any other questions about passing parameters and returning values? No questions? Let's make one more sample program, based on those concepts, and then we'll move on to records. And this time we'll specify a somewhat interesting program. I'll call this post increment, which is one of the operators of C. In other words, this particular sample program serves the purpose of illustrating mechanisms in this class, but it also serves to explain one of the most confusing operators in C and C++. It is the plus plus operator. Okay, it's also called a post increment operator, which turns out to be kind of confusing because of its nature. We'll just say that the subroutine takes a parameter and we'll pass it by reference. And the subroutine itself would have a local variable. I'll just call it I, it doesn't matter which one I use. And it doesn't like that because I is replaced by a capital I. I'll call it Y, just to avoid that problem. The subroutine will do this. It will make a copy of X into Y initially. And then it will say, okay, we'll just add 1 to X. And because we are going to return a value, we can now specify to return the value of Y. And define sub. It should look somewhat confusing to you because that's why people have problems about this in cisp300. Because what we're doing here is there's only one thing that is passed by the invoke statement, which is parameter X. But what we are doing is we are first saving the value of X, and then we go ahead and change the value of X. But when we are returning a value, we are returning the old value of X. Okay, this is called post increment in C. But we can emulate the effect in a subroutine in this class. So here we'll define our usual main subroutine. And this time I'll have local variable J because it doesn't like I. And then we'll take a look at what it is going to do. Let's see. Oh, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll use 2 print statements to figure out what they are going to print. We'll first print the result of invoking post increment and using J to specify parameter X. And then we'll print just the value of local variable J all by itself, and define sub, invoke main, and this is our sample program. Like that. Are there any questions regarding the construction used in this sample program before we actually go ahead and try to trace it? It should not have anything that we have not talked about. We talked about passing by reference. We talked about local variables, typical assignment statements. We talked about returning a value. So it has nothing that we have not talked about, but the effect of this is somewhat interesting. I also forgot one additional line. I forgot to initialize j. So we have to give j a specific value before we proceed with this. So we'll just go ahead and give it a value of 5. And I'll go ahead and save the file first. We call that post increment, same name as the subroutine. Now we'll go ahead and trace the subroutine. We need a column for comments because we are printing something later on. But for now, we can scroll it out of the screen because we won't be needing it until we get back to line 11 and line 12. Then we have line number. There's nothing to say about precondition because we don't have any global variables at all. Then we start execution on line 14. And we have to remember where to go back to, which is post. Then we move on to line 10 inside the subroutine main. Oh, we forgot the other thing. We have to set up the local variable j, which starts with an unknown value. Line 10 doesn't do a whole lot of interesting stuff. All it does is to initialize j to 5. So j as a local variable now has a value of 5. Moving on to line 11. Line 11 is going to invoke subroutine post increment. But because post increment is returning a value, we have to use return info instead of return line number, because by the time we get back to line 11, there are some additional stuff that we have to do. So that's why we have to set up column E as return info. When you set up return info, you have to write out pretty much the entire original line, except the invocation itself is replaced by a single question mark. And don't forget the parameter, because post increment has one parameter x as well as a local variable j. The local variable y. As a local variable, y starts with an unknown value, and as a passed by reference parameter, x depends on what I'm using to pass to it. In this case, I am using j of main, which in this case is column D, to pass by reference to x. As a result, x is an alias of column D. Are there any questions at this point when we set up column E, F, and G? No questions? Okay. Then we'll go ahead and proceed to inside the subroutine post increment starting on line 4. Line 4 is going to copy the value of x to y. We look up x. X is also known as column D. We look up column D. It has a value of 5. As a result, y will now have a value of 5. Then we move on to line 5. Line 5 is evaluating x plus 1 on the right-hand side. X is an alias of column D. Column D now has a value of 5. As a result, x will be incremented to 5. 5 plus 1 is 6. We store the result back into x. X is an alias of column D, and as a result, column D is incremented to 6. Do we have any questions at this point? No questions? Okay. After line 5, we go to line 6. Line 6 is the end of this subroutine, which means at this time we deallocate all the columns that we have allocated earlier. And then we go back to the line indicated by return info, which is line 11. But line 11 is no longer looking like this in the pseudocode because we have just resolved